Well, hello there. Did you know your personality can influence your chances of marriage, divorce, your political views, your career choices, life expectancy, and even happiness? So I've set myself the task of explaining and sharing everything I know about personality, psychology, and related concepts over the next few videos, starting with this one, which is more of a broad overview, and then delving into subsequent traits or specific traits of personality in each of the following videos. So in this video, we're going to cover an introduction to personality, how personality is measured, a brief overview of the Big Five model and its traits, and then finally delve into a little bit of the genetic aspect of personality. So one of the main definitions of personality is the enduring patterns of thoughts, behaviors, and emotions that distinguish one individual from the next. So far, nothing that I've said is particularly groundbreaking. However, there is a slightly different way of looking at personality that I particularly like that also helps give you a more empathetic viewpoint towards everyone else. That is, personality is your programmed set of perceptual filters that influence how you see the world and what you tend to focus on. This is basically a fancy way of saying we all see the world differently and through a different type of lens. And that is because if you look at any particular situation, there's so many different things going on and so many different things that you could potentially focus on. And therefore, we have to take a narrow viewpoint on any particular event, and the particular viewpoint or lens that you tend to choose is often based on your personality. A particular example that I think sums this up really nicely is that imagine you're walking down the street and you come across a crowded situation where people are surrounding an emergency scenario. So maybe someone's had a fall or an accident, or maybe even a heart attack. Because there are so many different things going on, from the lights and the noise of the emergency vehicles, to the whispers of the crowd, and even the buildings that have no relationship to this particular scenario in the background. What you might tend to focus on will vary from one individual to the next, and maybe one person focuses on the crowd specifically and the magnitude of the situation, while others might be focusing more on the emotional aspect of what's happening and how the families of the individual affected, what kind of emotional impact it might be having on them, and the sense of distress that they must be experiencing. The thing about personality is that we often fall into the trap of assuming that everyone else sees the situation in the exact same way as we do, but in reality, we're all experiencing things in a totally different way. For some, it's going to be more emotional, for others, it's going to be more rational, for others, they see things in a very artistic way, while others see things in a very practical way. This means that at any given moment or any particular situation, every individual is experiencing that slightly differently, or in some cases, very differently. The side effect of this is that every single person is only witnessing a small subset of all the different things that are going on in that moment. And therefore, we have a very either distorted view or a very narrow view of what's actually going on. And this is why when you build up a bigger profile with different viewpoints and kind of stitch them together, you get a much more accurate perspective of what's actually happening. This even comes into things such as political viewpoints, and this is probably the most obvious case where people fall into one set of beliefs or ideas and assume that the other person is completely wrong. Obviously, it can sometimes happen that a person or a group of people have the facts wrong, but it's often the case that people are just viewing the same situation rather differently, and this could be anything from a political candidate all the way down to an ideological level. Interestingly, people have tried to work out and put their finger on what exactly is personality for a very long time, and it goes all the way back to Hippocrates, where he came up with the idea of the 4 temperaments. And then for a long time since, people have naturally gravitated towards the idea that everyone fits into one of several buckets or discrete personality types. And this is even continued today when we see things such as the 16 personalities or even the Myers-Briggs. So it turns out that personality is captured much better, not in discrete categories or discrete types, but instead on a continuous spectrum. And if you can break personality down into several traits, each of those traits then is measured along a spectrum, and where you sit on each of those traits can be combined into a personality that you can then communicate. So how is personality measured? Well, one of the things that seems to be common across all of these assessments is that they're done through a series of questionnaires where you self-assess. Now you might be thinking, is it actually accurate to assess yourself on your personality traits? Well, it turns out that it actually is surprisingly accurate because of the nature of these tests and the types of questions that you have to answer. This works because of something called the lexical hypothesis, and this basically states that key personality traits become embedded in the language that you use on a regular basis. So by asking people to describe themselves using various adjectives and descriptive words, you can then begin to form correlations between these words and find what underlying traits these actually represent or measure. Then by using a process called factor analysis, you can begin to relate interconnected words together and separate them from words that have no correlation. What numerous experiments and studies show is that when you go through this process, all of the terms seem to separate out into 5 distinct categories, which gives rise to the Big Five personality model. The Big Five, or the 5-factor model, is one of the most comprehensive, intuitive, useful, and powerful ways of describing and communicating about people's personalities that we have available today. In fact, a meta-analysis has shown that it's doubly as powerful when it comes to its predictive power in terms of what kind of life outcomes you're going to get when compared to something like the Myers-Briggs model. So now that we know each of these descriptive terms and adjectives seem to separate down into one of 5 buckets, all that we need to do now is to give each one of those buckets a label, and then we'll go through what each one of those represents. And the first trait is extroversion, and this represents sociability, assertiveness, talkativeness, and enthusiasm. And it's kind of shown in terms of someone who enjoys social gatherings and has an energetic approach to life. And then on the flip side, someone with low extroversion, or is often called an introvert, is often reserved, reflective, and comfortable with solitude. The next trait is agreeableness, and this is represented by compassion, cooperativeness, trust, and altruism. And you often see this in terms of someone who has a willingness to help others, they are empathetic, and often have many harmonious relationships. And then on the flip side, someone with low agreeableness tends to be competitive, critical, and sometimes antagonistic. The next bucket or trait is conscientiousness, and this represents organization, diligence, discipline, and reliability. And this is often shown through goal-orientated behaviors, careful planning, and adherence to rules. Whereas someone with low conscientiousness often shows spontaneity, flexibility, and sometimes disorganization. The fourth one is neuroticism, and this represents emotional instability, anxiety, moodiness, and irritability. These people are prone to stress, negative emotions, and worry. And then someone with low neuroticism presents calmness, resilience, and even temperedness. And finally, we have openness, and this represents imagination, creativity, intellectual and artistic curiosity, preference for novelty and variety, and is often shown in terms of their enjoyment of artistic activities, intellectual pursuits, and new experiences. Whereas someone with low openness represents a preference for routine, they are often practical, and they come across as being down to earth. So it may or may not be clear yet, but no matter where you fall on the personality spectrum, there are pros and cons to every single point. So for example, someone who's highly agreeable, it might seem like compassion, empathy is always a good thing, and then someone who is low agreeable is a bad person. But actually, there are benefits to being competitive, and there are benefits to not being overly concerned with how you come across to everyone else. We're going to delve into this more specifically with each trait in the following videos, but I think it's important to understand that every single trait, no matter what value you have, where you fall on that spectrum, there are pros and cons. And in many ways, this is proven through the field of genetics, because if a trait was actually bad or disadvantageous from an evolutionary perspective, then it would have fizzled out and disappeared from the gene pool. But the fact there is so much variety and diversity in personalities shows that there has to be conditions where each of those personalities thrive. So the thing about personality traits is they are heritable, but they are also impacted massively based on your environment. So roughly 50% of your personality traits are going to be influenced by your genetics, and the other 50% based on your experiences and the environment. So what this means in practice is that your propensity for things such as positive emotion or happiness is actually governed partially by your genetics. So if you're someone who's prone to not experience much positive emotion, it might seem like you're trapped by those genetic constraints, but in reality it's only 50% responsible, and 50% in terms of your environment and what you tend to expose yourself to is still a huge amount of power that you can put towards yourself in changing those things and putting yourself in a better position and then living the life that you want to live. So again, coming back to that previous point about how we have such a broad range of different personalities and how they've survived across time shows that there is a time and a place for every type of trait and every type of personality. And what this does is it shifts the emphasis towards yourself in finding the optimal environment for your particular one. This means that different types of personalities are going to be suited to different types of professions. So maybe you have a natural proclivity for creativity, and therefore you should find a field where you're allowed to flourish in that regard, where someone else might have a very different trait and therefore they may not be suited to something involving creativity. So now that we know what each of the traits roughly does, in the following video I'm going to cover the trait of extroversion, and in the following ones each of the subsequent traits from the Big 5 model. And we're going to do a deep dive into each of those traits, give you the takeaways, the correlations between life outcomes and behaviors, and go into much more detail. So if you enjoy this type of content, then definitely subscribe and look out for those following videos. As always, if you got something from this video, I'd really appreciate if you could like, leave a comment down below, or even subscribe. That'd be greatly appreciated. And otherwise, I will see you in the next video.